Good afternoon. My name is Ken Krafchek, Director and Faculty, MFA in Community Arts Program. The MFA faculty and students, along with the whole of the Maryland Institute College of Art, welcome you, the audience, to part 3 of the mixed media series, Rights and Wrongs, Liberty, Democracy, and the Struggle for Human Rights. This theme, explored from a range of perspectives, includes the history of race in America, Black Lives Matter movement, women's suffrage, 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, immigrant rights, public health versus individual liberty, voter rights and voter access, freedom of speech and the arts, and other topics and approaches. Today's guest is my dear friend and colleague, Amalia Mesa-Bains. After Amalia's presentation, we will end with a question and answer session, time permitting. Please type questions into the Q&A box or Facebook. We will do our best to accommodate. Amalia Mesa-Bains is an internationally renowned artist, scholar, and curator. Throughout her career, Amalia has expanded understandings of Latinx artists, references to spiritual practices, and vernacular traditions. Through her altar installations, articles, and exhibitions, in 1992, she was awarded a Distinguished Fellowship from the MacArthur Foundation. Her work has been shown at institutions such as the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Whitney Museum of American Art at Phillip Morris, New Museum, and international venues around the world. As a cultural critic, she co-authored along with Bell Hooks, Homegrown, Engaged Cultural Criticism. She founded and directed the Visual and Public Art Department at California State University at Monterey Bay. Amalia's community work includes Board of Trustee positions with the Mexican Museum in San Francisco and advisory boards for the Galleria de la Raza and the Social Public Resource Center in Los Angeles. The title of Amalia's session is Toward the Goal of Community and Healing. Please welcome our honored guest, Amalia Mesa-Bains.
Thank you, Ken, and I thank MICA's faculty, staff, and administration for inviting me to participate in what I consider a very historic series, a very timely series. I'm speaking to you today, a week after our election and in the aftermath of the potential new administration coming in. And it's a time that all of us, I think, are reflecting on the meaning of democracy, both as citizens and as artists. It has been a time of chaos and challenge in our democratic society, and we have been required as artists and art educators to examine our role in the practice of justice and liberation. Our public struggles of community engagement and cultural transformation are part of the societal healing needed in this area of rupture and conflict, and I hope a time of promise. So I'm going to show you some images today, beginning with my own work and including other colleagues who I think embody to some degree the change we are looking forward to. I think of art as a vehicle, and to some degree that vehicle leads us to the change that we're hoping to make. What we're thinking about now is what kind of work can we do in the future? How will it fit in to this changing democracy? And often we begin with our own images of ourselves and how that fits into society. We are our best subject at the beginning of art making. And for me, my family has always been the sort of substrata and foundation of my work. These are my ancestors, my grandmother, Mariana Escuero, who's pregnant at that time in 1913, with my father, Lawrence Mesa, and her brothers. This is a picture that was taken in the city of Querétaro, which was the seat of the government, and it was in the midst of the Mexican Revolution. So from an early age, I was aware through my family stories and history of the issues of immigration. This is the second image of my family, the founding family, my grandmother Mariana, as she's older with her brothers. All of these elements of my life, the family history, the narratives of escape from Mexico, and to some degree, the reality of my parents as undocumented Mexicans in America, contributed to my own sense of self, the anxiety that I felt as a young person because of their undocumented status. And like many people in my generation, we look to our family for a sense of safety and protection. This is an image of my mother and father, Lawrence and Marina Mesa, with my younger sister, Judy Mesa, who is no longer with us, but who remains for me a figure of love and a cherished history. That picture of my sister at her first Holy Communion is really resonant with the way I explored my own family gatherings and my own sense of that belonging. I've written in time over about the concept of domesticana, or how in the Chicano term of rascuachismo, which means to make the most from the least, how we use the discards, the bricolage, the decorative elements to communicate our sense of our cultural patrimony and heritage. So in my Venus Envy series, the first chapter is called The First Holy Communion Moments Before the End, and this is a shot of it. In that exploration of that family history, I also integrated some of the Mesoamerican concepts of the indigenous history of Mexicans. This is Coatlicue in the mirror. So this idea of my own autobiography, autotopography, as Jennifer Gonzalez has named it, is a story of belonging, of family, of church, really of patriarchy and emancipation. And in that same sense, it is a collective history. So in the little box in the middle of the exhibit, which I call the Museum of Self, there are images of the anthropologist Alicia Gonzalez, the Chicana artist Esther Hernandez, the veil of Lowry Sims, the curator. Many people contributed to the development of this piece. So I moved, like many artists, from my own self-examination, my family history, into the idea of belonging in community. And my first experience of belonging in community, of course, was the Chicano movement. And that was a period of time in the 70s in which rupture and change and collective action, not unlike the time now in Black Lives Movement, was really the beginning of undertaking a kind of civil rights activism. I have used often the works of Erik Erikson to try to make sense of that. He wrote in his book, Life History and the Historical Moment, the notion that an individual's life history is sometimes crossed by critical moments of group life. And in that moment, those who by a combination of talent, abilities, and unruliness will rise to the surface. And in that moment, they may change the identity of their own group. So for me, that meant the Chicano movement, the ability to work collectively with others, and exploring the cultural history of my family and my community. So one of the governing sort of drives in the Chicano movement was the notion of cultural reclamation, to take back things that we have been willing or forced to give up in order to be American. So I started with the Days of the Dead because it was a vehicle that Chicanos could use to bring to light the lost histories and the unknown leaders of their own community. This is my first piece. It was done in 1977, and it was called The Altar to Five Women. I didn't know how to make sugar skulls then, so I made soft sculptures. And the people that I'm honoring have to do with my grandmothers, Mariana and Amalia, my tia or my aunt, Angela, my best friend, Susana, who died when I was 20 years old, and the first interest I had with Frida Kahlo. This is the first collective altar done at the Galeria de la Raza in 1978, in which we lectured and learned about Frida Kahlo and invited other artists to come into the community gallery and place offerings. We used the Imogen Cunningham photo of Frida Kahlo in order to document her life in San Francisco, and we interviewed many people from that background. So this idea that we are embodying our community history through these collective efforts leads us into the idea that we as artists have developed public strategies. Now, while I was circumscribing sacred space in order to bring spiritual traditions to the foreground in our movement, my colleague and sister, well, my soul sister, Judith Baca, was creating through the Social Public Art Resource Center the first large-scale mural on the history of California that is now known as the Great Wall. Now, Judy Baca, for those of you who don't know her well, is a world-known muralist. And what she attempted to do in the Great Wall, which is an ongoing project, was to use the history of California that was not known, and it was a diverse history. And she brought together over 400 artists, 80 youth offenders, students from a number of schools, to begin to develop this framework of truth. What you're looking at now is one of the earlier segments of the Great Wall. And you can see by the text that it deals with unsigned treaties, deportations, and parts of the natural environment in earthquakes. This piece is one of my very favorite, and it is a piece that deals with the division of the barrios at Chavez Ravine in order to bring in Dodger Stadium. It also deals with the period of time of the Red Scare and McCarthyism. So in this public strategy, this long overdue history is brought to the fore in a place called the Tunga Wash. It was part of the Los Angeles River that was cemented over. And in that long space, this mural develops over decades. She's in the process now of redoing it, clarifying pieces, and adding the decades of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So this is an ongoing strategy of circumscribing public space, defining community history, and engaging the public. This is part of a piece done by Pepón Osorio, and for those who don't know his work well, Pepón Osorio has had a long career engaging community. He had a partnership with many different communities in the East Coast, and this is one done in the city of Philadelphia. The piece is called Reform, and Reform began in 2013 after the closing of 22 Philadelphia schools, including Fair Hill Elementary School, where students had a familial and almost parent-like experience of their teachers and their faculty, and most of all, the engagement of parents. So the closing of this school was an enormous rupture, and many saw it as an abandonment by the Philadelphia School District of brown and Black, Puerto Rican, and African-American families in the inner city. As Pepón developed Reform, he brought together students, families, and some of the faculty from this long closed school. It was done as a kind of learning experience, which was shaped by the students themselves. Pepón Osorio is faculty at Tyler School and Temple University, Tyler Art School. So this was an enormous experience for students who ended up recreating their classrooms. After the schools were closed, the school district left them abandoned. And so the students and faculty, under the direction of Pepón, went back and retrieved many of their belongings and leftover furnishings. So what you're looking at is a recreation of a classroom in Temple University. So imagine that these young students, still suffering from this sense of dislocation and loss, are allowed to come and develop their own stories and narratives. And they come to Temple University to create this piece over a series of years of interviews and planning meetings. They were creating their own narratives. So the wallpaper that you see behind the actual shrines are writings of the students themselves as they tell the story of their loss. Within each of the shrines, mounted on these giant pencils, are videos made by the students of themselves being interviewed about the experience of this dislocation. This is probably one of the most complete community engagements that I have ever seen in a project. So these student shrines, their vernacular makeup is part of the aesthetic of Piponosorio, but the stories of the families, of the students, and of the faculty are their own. It's one of the few projects that I've seen completely driven by the work of the students themselves. In the work we do, both as artists and as citizens, we often find ourselves facing the issue of cultural transformation. There's a lot of language now around culture, canceling culture, reused cultural reclamation, but these processes of cultural transformation are often a renewal and affirmation of communities, of their histories, of their families, of their struggles for democracy and human rights. As artists, we work with these cultural materials and transform them toward the greater goal of social justice and community memory. One of the things that all of the minority communities, I think, have faced over these years is a sense of absence, not the absence of experience, but the absence of being represented. This is one of my own pieces. This is called Transparent Migration. Because I grew up in an undocumented home, even though I was born here in the United States, I felt always a sense of kind of conflict between what I imagined was the history of my family and what I was experiencing in the United States. In 2001, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art began an exhibition, and I was on the original planning commission for the concept of Aslan, the journey to Aslan, which was based on a Mesoamerican space, which we would probably describe now as northern part of Mexico and the southwestern part of the United States. For many young Chicanos in the movement, Aslan represented a spiritual source, a sense of belonging and beginning, but it was often referred to as a myth. What the exhibition, which was an archaeological and anthropological exhibition at LACMA, showed to us is that this did really exist. It was a period of time prior to the colonial era when indigenous people lived within these areas of the Aslan, and it traded spiritual objects and also economic trade. So I decided to do a piece about migration, but look at it from the point of the symbols of endurance. So the glass maguey give us a sense of how people have endured like the indigenous landscape for all these years. Hanging inside is the wedding mantilla of my own experience, and also below it, the glass figures and glass objects are the recreation of Tenochtitlan, the ancient city the Spanish found when they arrived in 1492, the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. So the idea that this cultural transformation is part of the way we as artists can work sometimes asks us to work in partnership with other institutions. I think the work of artists in this age is in many ways multidisciplinary. We have to be researchers, archaeologists, anthropologists, critical theorists, writers. We have to take on many of those skills in our lifetimes in order to do the work that is required of us. In the 90s, there was a great deal of work done around the investigation of museums. People like Fred Wilson and Guillermo Gomez Peña used the museum as a site of intervention. I had the opportunity in 2012 to work with the Fowler Museum at UCLA. And that museum is an anthropological museum. They invited me to participate in their 50th anniversary, and they wanted me to do an altar. But I asked instead, might I do a cabinet of curiosity or a Wunderkammer, which were forms used in the colonial enterprise in the 16th and 17th century. They were often places in which very wealthy individuals, royals, and others in Europe could collect the objects of the colonial interventions in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia. And the Folk Museum of Fowler, or the examination of folk forms at Fowler, led me to look into their collection. I was very lucky because over a 2-year period of time, I visited them a total of 6 times and selected objects from the museum that I thought represented to some degree what we call the mestizaje, or the mixing of races. So you see that in each of the 3 areas of the cabinet, there are figures, and I think of them as witnesses to history. The central figure are Mesoamerican figures from a burial ground. To the right is an African figure of divination, and on the left, a colonial figure of John the Baptist. So what I did was to collect the images, eventually select the objects, work with the designers to plan the actual cabinet, and in the lower half, integrate my own objects, my own spiritual traditions, and my family histories to create a juxtaposition. This is about lost histories, stolen works, but it's also about recovery and renewal. We know now that the slave trade that went into the New World, 95% of it went into Mexico and Latin America, and only 5% into the United States. So in some respect, the issues of race and racism have been persistent both in Latin America and the United States. So we now talk about that slave trade and its influence in the development of identity in Mexico as el tercer raíz, or the 3rd root, what we know now to be the African descendancy. And I find that in my own family. My grandmother and her brothers were mulatto, and my grandmother's last husband was an African American. So some of my father's brothers were also mixed race. And in my generation, I married my husband, African American, Richard Baines, and was the 3rd generation of interracial marriage. So for me, the interest in tercer raíz was actually quite personal, as well as collective and familial. What I tried to do with these collections was examine things like slavery, violence, civil life, history, relationships, and war, and eventually the negotiation of new identities. In the last piece in this section on cultural transformation, I really want to talk about a new piece that I did along with Angelica Muro for People for the American Way, who did a project led by Carrie Mae Weems, the legendary photographer. And the project was called Enough of Trump. And Angelica and I designed this piece called Basta. We take great pride in it. It was one of the large billboards in the swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona. So we take a little joy in the thought that perhaps our Basta contributed to the swing of those states from red to blue. But all of this work that we do, both in community engagement and cultural transformation, has to lead to the place we need to find ourselves in now. We are in tremendous need for our society to heal the deep divisions of values, class, race, gender, sexuality, religion, and the inequities that we face economically. The pandemic has brought a new view of what many of us had already known and experienced, which is the tremendous gap between the incomes and resources and health access of Black and Brown communities and other communities like Native American and the broader society. So we're looking now at ways in which this society can be healed. It's especially important after the election because we know that this ongoing dispute may cause others in the society to feel even a deeper sense of displacement. For myself, I talked earlier about the idea of borders and how immigration, and for me, undocumented immigration, touched my life from my early years. When I was a child, I wasn't even sure that I wasn't actually born in Mexico and had to ask my parents about it because in civics class, I was concerned about whether I was actually a citizen or not. So I think for many young children, these disputes along the border have had a tremendous effect on them. And for those of us in social justice communities, the separation of 565 young people from their parents at the border, for those Mexicans and Central Americans trying to come in for a new life, has been a tremendous tragedy. We know now that the numbers are even higher, that there actually were several thousand families separated. We can only document those that were recorded. And so I think that the idea of the borders rises up over and over again in the history of our country. And the border between Mexico and the United States, in which we share the same continent, is probably the one that is most ruptured and in which we have the most conflict. I did this piece originally in 1991 for the Decade Show, in which I was looking at the idea of anti-immigrant xenophobia, the ideas of displacement, engaging with themes of having a home, losing a home, and the idea that these displacements contributed to the instability in our own country. I did this piece with my late colleague, Victor Zamudio Taylor. So both of our family photos are on the wall behind, and the family altar at the top is part of my own tradition of altar making. The figure of Saint Joseph behind the dresser, he was a figure associated in the Catholic religion to finding lost things. And so Judy Baca told me that her grandmother believed that he was to help her find her children who were lost during the war. So she tied him up in the closet and said that he would not be let out until the boys came home. And every night you could hear a knocking. Eventually, boys came back and he was released from the closet. But these folk tales built into the spiritual traditions have been an area in which I have worked for many years. Sometimes healing is both personal and collective. I experienced an automobile accident in 2003 in which I broke my neck, my C1, my elbow, my wrist, and my leg, and shattered part of my arm. In the years following, from 2003 to 2008, I was in numerous surgeries and rehabilitations for my physical health. And in that period of time, I experienced the post-traumatic disorder that people have after war or after serious incidences of violence. I went to an actual therapist for post-traumatic disorder, but I also turned to the traditions of curanderismo, which are the indigenous healing traditions of Mexico and Latin America, not unlike the healing traditions in Africa and Asia. In the world of curanderismo, there is an inseparability of the body and the mind. There is a mediation between the divine and the earthly. And there is an understanding that all healing must come not just through the individual, but in the collective of their family, community, and friends. So I tried to do that for myself. And in that process, I created this piece, the Curanderas Botánica, which was for me a way to integrate Western medicine, which you see at the beginning of the top of the table. I then moved to the healing traditions of the curandera in the bottom of the table. I integrated narrative elements of my father's healing. And the light box is the image of my grandmother, Mariana Escovedo, who, while she was not a curandera, she used curanderas techniques with my father. The 3 bottles or large jars of water with pine boughs in them were used when he was a child to cure his bronchial condition, because the pine boughs release a resin and he would drink the water later. There's a snake skin on the lower table because she put snake powder on his food because he had skin lesions and she was trying to help him. In the large cabinet are layers and layers of the history of my family and their healing. And the small painting to the left is a painting by Juan Bosa, my late colleague, who was a Santeria practitioner and who helped me in many times during my healing and illness. This is the table with the healing book created to narrate the family history of curanderismo. One of the best pieces that I have ever seen, in which I think there is a kind of healing, goes all the way back to the apartheid uprising in Soweto in 1976. This is a piece done in 1991 by Mildred Howard, and it is called 10 Little Children Standing in a Line. One got shot, and then there were 9. This piece amplifies the story of the 10,000 school children that battled the authorities of apartheid oppression to try to gain freedom from the Afrikaner language that the Dutch had employed in their schools. It was a community uprising that resulted in the death of as many as 700 and the injuries to over 4,000. It was a very well-known incident. And this newspaper article shows a young woman carrying a neighbor boy. His name is Hector Peterson, and his sister is running alongside him. He later died in the hospital. Mildred Howard is an African-American artist who has used her skills in installation and photography and printmaking to address many of these very large-scale incidences of community violence and of loss of history. What you're seeing on the wall now, behind in the back of the installation, are bullets. They've been emptied of their explosives and they've been cut to fit on the wall. And these hands are the hands the children raised up as they tried to keep the police from shooting them. So this particular piece to me is a link to what we're facing now. Our own societal healing is in many ways tied to the enormous police violence against Blacks. I know this experience in my own life. I've been married to Richard Baines for almost 55 years. And in those years, he's been pulled over and arrested at least 10 times. We even had to go to court once to win a case in which he was falsely arrested. But in those moments, I experienced the terror that many of these families feel when they don't know what will happen. And we know the story of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, so many others. And it has become a space of community memory, ceremonial healing, and I think for us, a kind of public movement of reconciliation. What I want to talk about now is really how through these steps we take and the various ways in which we work, from community engagement to cultural transformation to societal healing, how we create as artists the path ahead. The images that you're looking at now are from the Enough of Trump project that Carrie Mae Weems led that involved many, many others, including Ruby Latoya, Fraser, Dawood Bey, So many artists, there are too many to name, but each of them created a billboard that was turned into a poster that was placed in swing states and other areas where we were trying to move the vote. Remember to Dream is Carrie Mae Weems' piece. Mine and Angelica's is Basta. And the idea that somehow we as artists can determine the path ahead, that we can bring together both the individual and the collective toward a shared goal of social justice and community memory. Many of the students at MICA, like students across the country and other younger artists, are examining their work. How is it that they construct a purposeful work that can define their own values and concerns? All of you are in the midst of a powerful moment of change in this country and possibly the world, as we try to salvage our place in climate control, address the racial and economic equity, the attention to sexuality and gender protection, and develop a new vision of educational promise. In many ways, the conversations we're having today, the ones that have come before in the other two series of democracy and the struggle for human rights, have really been about what we as individuals do and how we do it collectively to change the future, not just of our nation, but of the world. So I'm hopeful that we can discuss this further in the questions, but I once again am thankful that we have been able to change some part of the future through the electorate, and we are all waiting to find out how that future will unfold. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amalia. It's wonderful to spend time with you again. It doesn't happen often enough, but we should make every effort to do so. Audience members, you're encouraged to insert questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen and or through Facebook. The fabulous MFACA GPA Jen will be facilitating parts of that. Go Jen. I have a few questions to get us going. Please know that Amalia would prefer a dialogue or an exchange, but I'll help a little to get us started, and hopefully everyone will fill in behind me. So Amalia, as artists, we work with cultural materials and transform them toward a greater goal of social justice and community memory. The term cultural work has in the past been utilized to describe the efforts of artists pursuing these goals. Does the term cultural worker still resonate with you?
I'm laughing because when I first started as an artist, we used the term cultural worker. And you've got to imagine this is like the 70s and we're coming out of Marxist dispositions toward, the civil rights movement, toward the Chicano movement. And so I used the term cultural worker for many, many years, and I still find value in it. How we define culture is often very much based on our own experience. So we have large concepts of culture as in a nation's culture, but we have smaller cultures within ethnic groups, political groups. And so I find that cultural work puts us on a more egalitarian level with other workers. And I find that very useful right now, because the disputes we're having, the divisions that we're engaged in, often fall back on the term elites, which I think is often misapplied. But elites can also include artists. And when we look back on artists in the past, many of them have been elites. Many of them are as wealthy as people in the stock market. And so I felt that using the term cultural worker meant that we were workers as in labor. And for Chicanos coming from working class backgrounds, as I grew up, my father had been a farm worker and then later went into the canneries. My mother was a maid and a housekeeper. I was the first to go to college in my immediate family and only the second in my extended family. So I saw myself as a laborer. I, grew up, had my first work permit at 12 years old so I could go to the packing sheds to cut apricots. I paid my way through college working every summer in the cannery because it was the most lucrative money that I could find to pay for my university. So I saw myself as a worker. And to some degree, even though my class disposition has certainly changed, I still find value in the term cultural worker. It puts me shoulder to shoulder with those other people who go out every day to work. Many of them my family, many of them in my community. So yes, I like it.
Well, to expand on that, if you could, how might this language release or introduce the artist to a greater potential and or relevance?
I think one, it breaks down the barriers between artists and others for everything I've talked about, for elitism, for the fact that by the time we get through art school and have spent a fortune, it's really hard to turn around and go back out into the world and find our place among other workers and take our place with others who are investigating the issues of our time. So I think that the more that we break down the categories, I have been referred to as an organic intellectual. I have a PhD in clinical psychology. I write, I've done television, but in my heart of hearts, I am still that young Mexican girl who worked in the cannery. I still feel in myself this desire to pitch in. And I think that as artists, we're gaining more and more skills to do the work that's required of us. I mean, addressing climate change or looking at gender and sexuality or being able to discuss issues of equity requires us to be well-informed. That may mean research, that may mean working in partnerships with other individuals with those skills. So I think that artists have to begin to think more of themselves in a collaborative space with others toward the goals of that social justice and liberation. Because, and I've said this to many students, the road of an artist is a long one. It begins in the individual and self, but eventually we find out we're not alone, and we find other artists, and then we find other workers, and then we find other scholars, and then we find other participants. But it's a long road in which you often do find yourself alone, and you have to find a way to endure. And that means looking not just into yourself, but the world around you. I've always said, without the community of Chicanas, other comadres, as I call them, in the Mexican tradition of compadrazgo, which means co-parentage. So when you get baptized, you have a godmother and a godfather, a madrina and a madrino. And once that happens, those people are your family and they are your parents, co-parents. So I didn't have children, nor did Judy Baca or Carmen Lomas Gades or many of us in the founding Chicana generation, but we use the term comadre to talk about our co-parentage of the movement, our co-parentage of the work we do. So I think that building community, finding partnerships, working collaboratively, all of those things break down the isolation that artists can sometimes feel. And it also brings into your experience creatively new sources of inspiration, new passions, and certainly greater convictions and commitments. Because I don't believe that you can do the work of an artist for 30, 40, 50 years without having a renewal. And that renewal comes as others come into your life that you can work with. So yes, I really do believe that we should reach out beyond the boundaries of just our art experience within colleges or within the museum world, because if you look there, you're really in serious trouble because you're not going to find a lot of collaboration. So I'm sorry, I ranted. Stop me when I rant. So.
Well, how about an even tougher question, perhaps? How best should a cultural worker be educated?
Oh, wow. Well, here I go again. Well, and, I'm an example. I have a master's, I have a bachelor's in art, visual arts. I have a master's in interdisciplinary education and a lifetime teaching credential, which I got through a program called Teacher Corps, which was fantastic because it brought me into the political life of the Mission District in San Francisco. Besides the Chicano movement, it politicized me. And my mentor, Yolanda Garfias-Wu, who was a Oaxacan teacher who had worked in the San Francisco Unified School District, one of the first indigenous teachers, brought me into the traditions of the Days of the Dead. I knew about them, but I hadn't experienced them. My family didn't do that. They hung out in graveyards, but they didn't do that. And so this idea of multiple levels of engagement. So the Master's in Education Interdisciplinary Ed led me to a PhD, a Master's and PhD in psychology, because in the schools that I taught in through Teacher Corps, there was violence in the housing projects. I started a mother's counseling group. I discovered that many of my students, as young as they were traumatized. And so I had to take classes at night to learn how to support them and how to develop those skills, which then led me to an interest in psychology. But when I got to the Wright Institute, where I did my graduate work, I discovered that I was most interested in issues of artistic and creative endeavor. So I did a dissertation that looked at the role of identity in the development, or the role of culture in the development of identity in a group of artists. So in that period of time, I learned to be an educator, a psychologist, and then I spent much of my time with others working in the field of anthropology and archaeology, forensic archaeologists. So over the years, I just kept adding on to the sort of container of skills and expanded my own interests. And so I encourage my students to take on, not necessarily do they have to go back to college and take other majors, but I think they have to be very inquisitive and examine the material around them. And if they need to gain skills to do that, then they do that. But I really do believe in a multidisciplinary artist. I think our art schools are remiss in not doing that. In other words, I think our training of artists, or I don't like the word training because it sounds like you do to pets, but our educating of young people, even older artists, really requires us to expand our definition of what it means to be an artist. I think we should be giving them research projects, I think, and I know you've done that, and I think they should be partnering in the community, interviewing elders, finding out what goes on. When we started our visual and public art program at Cal State University, Monterey Bay, we developed a class on community skills. And one of the first things we did was ask our students to basically research a community. They could drive around and look. They could go online, find out how many schools, how many churches, economic levels, roles of employment, and then begin interviewing community leaders, elders, and ethnic communities. All of those aspects were what we considered community-based skills that our students would have to develop authentic projects in community. So I just think that we are, and you and I did it together. I mean, I look back on, the community research and convening projects that we did. I look back on what we did in partnerships with Chicago, with so many other schools. Because what we were doing was examining the making of art in a community and backing up from that, what kind of skills would you need to do that? And then trying to provide experiences in those skills. So anyway, that is to me an area I hope that we'll go back to again. For a while, the interest in community art lapsed away, but I think given the future ahead of us, the deterioration of our democracy, the failing of the human rights under this administration, we have no choice but to go back to the drawing boards and say, once again, We need to know how to make art, not just for ourselves, not just for the museums, not just for the art market, but we have to learn how to make art for the society at large, for all the reasons we've been talking about. Yeah.
Well, I think you addressed this question of what role the Academy plays in cultural
Yeah.
work, but if you want to expand on it, feel free.
Well, I think we still have a number of schools that are working in the same way that you are at MICRA and that we are at VPA at CSUMB. But I think we need to rethink what we've learned in the about 10 years. What works, what doesn't work. I think for us, one of the things that we discovered was that the funding world that supported us, and we had money from Lila Wallace, Nathan Cummings, that funding world has changed. And post 9/11, it really changed. And now, post Trump, if we can say that, hopefully, I think we're going to go back again and look at how are things being funded. And post pandemic, for sure, health issues, working in partnership with frontline essential workers. I am still working with the Galeria de la Raza in San Francisco, which is a 50-year-old community-based organization in the Mission District. And what we have been doing under the leadership of Ani Rivera, one of the great new young community-based leaders, is really look at the Galeria de la Raza as a first responder, that we are helping people. We help them through the census. We're working with them now in terms of the pandemic, their healthcare testing, that art is important, but only so much as it serves as a vehicle for the health and the sustenance of community. Because without community, what value can art have? I mean, it will always have value. I don't mean to be petty, but it will always have value in the art market and the art world. You know, whether it's hedge funds or whether it's, you know, museums, people will still buy art and trade art, but that doesn't change the life of artists very much because rarely do they enjoy the resources of that. But I think, if anything, this last 4 years has really taught us the value of our democracy, has really called upon many of us to examine the needs of our community and to feel responsible in some compassionate and creative way for improving that. And so I think that it's not just artists, it's the arts institutions in our communities. And I've always said that places like the Galeria de la Raza, Social Public Art Resource Center, Studio Museum of Harlem, the Chinese Historical Society, whatever it is, they are incubators. And in those spaces, our young people get their first chances to exhibit, their first chances to work effectively in community. And so we, I think, are going to be looking more and more at how to resuscitate those models and look for new ways, not to just fund them, but to organize them and to partner them with people who are committed to sustaining that kind of community work.
Well, thank you, Amalia. While I process 2 or 3 really terrific questions in the chat, which I'll relay to you in a moment, I'll leave you with this perhaps more playful question, but not unimportant.
Yes.
Given the qualities of cultural workers, community-based artists, et cetera, as you described, requiring giftedness, unruliness, and talent, how does one teach toward that or nurture such things?
Well, I always begin with unruliness because it's my favorite. And also because as an unruly child, and even an unruly adult from time to time, I felt very much that aspect of my personality or my skill sets was very suppressed in school. And even though I think I probably would have been put into gifted and talented if I were in school as a young person now, Mexican children in those days were not. And you have to remember that I came into elementary school, this is how old I am, in the 50s, the late 50s. So we're talking about on the edge of segregation. And so myself and my cousins and some of my neighbors were the first Mexicans in the public schools. And this is Sunnyvale, California, now known as Silicon Valley. But we were just coming out of not the overt segregation that you might find in Texas, but other kinds of segregation. So my creative unruliness was not well received, shall we say. And my talent and giftedness was somewhat recognized, but no place to put it. So I think one of the ways, and this is me speaking as a teacher and as someone who trained teachers, I think one, we have to examine some of the models of education which fall under the rubric of analytical, which means that there is only one right answer. That defeats the purpose of creative thinking if there's only one right answer. And also that you privilege people who are articulate and more vocal. And in a emotional style of learning in which there are more than one right answer and creative notions are welcomed, I think you can make education more supportive of the unruliness and of the creativity and of the talent. But it makes us have to look at education not simply as an industry. And we're coming out now from this administration of the worst educational leadership we've probably ever seen in our country. And so that's going to be one of the really big areas that I think all of us will have to pitch into, which is how to improve education, not just on a national level, but on a state level. And of course, English as a second language has always been a sort of big bat that you can get hit with if you are an immigrant. So I think we have to rethink so much of how we make educational accessible for families, how we engage those parents in learning, and how we make students feel welcome. When I was teaching, we had a literature-based approach to learning. So it meant those people learning to read would learn to read by reading books they really liked, as opposed to basal texts. And so we often said that there was a kind of equation, E plus T equals M. And E was the experience that students brought into the learning. Where do they live? How many people do they live with? What do they know? Many of these kids in elementary school know a great deal. They take care of their siblings. They go to the grocery store. They translate to English for their elder parents. And then T is the text. You, the teacher, bring that into the classroom, whether it's a book, a film, a lesson. And what you're after is not knowledge. That comes with it, but it's meaning. Because without meaning, people have no way to use their knowledge. So I think that we're going to be, in the next years, rethinking again education, hopefully making it more accessible for students from diverse backgrounds. And maybe that will make it easier for those who don't fit the educational model to be supported. I really think we are really engaged in a new vision of education, and there will be people to do it for the first time in a long time.
Interestingly enough, we have a question in the chat. How young artists, how can they afford school?
Yeah, that's a question I have, because I know how much your school costs, and I know how much many of the other schools where I go to lecture. You know, I really think we're going to have to figure out other funding sources, partnering with corporations. I don't know what it's going to take, but if you want young people to come into some of the more, I think, I don't want to use the elite, but the more successful academy, you have to find a way to fund it. Otherwise, you will only get students whose financial backgrounds and class dimension don't necessarily lean them toward community work. And I know that you've had to face that. Several Cal Arts had to face it, so many. But Cal Arts did a really good job of developing a whole system of funding and support for students who could not afford the tuition. So I think it's going to involve, I think, the institutions themselves determining what the values are of having students from diverse backgrounds and how they want to go about making that more accessible. Because it can't be done by single individuals or a recruitment office. It has to be the commitment of the institution itself. And that's harder.
Thank you. We have another question. What are ways that white identifying Hispanics, Mexican Americans, and others can creatively connect to and engage with cultural expressions that you've referenced without colonizing or being exploitive?
Now you're saying white identified, meaning European identified?
I'm
Say it to
afraid
me
I-
again, because I'm not sure I
What
understand.
are ways that white identifying Hispanics, Mexican Americans, and others can creatively connect to and engage with cultural expressions that you've been referencing?
I have a really simple answer. Your abuela. Please talk to your grandmother, or in your case, because you're all younger, your great grandmother. You know, this is one of the things I found in my teaching. When I first started teaching the Day of the Dead class, I had many Hispanic students. And when we first started talking about family histories, they were absolutely like vacant. They didn't know what I meant. And so I'd say, well, what is your mother or your grandma say? Well, my mother didn't want me to take this class because she says we don't do that. And I said, well, did you talk to your grandmother? And they said, no. And I said, well, you need to go talk to your grandmother because she might know a little more than you do. And she would probably be able to tell you the family history. So they would come back with all these pictures, little photo albums that the grandmothers had hidden away. And so they discovered that it was really their grandmothers that more than their parents, although they had younger parents who had immigrated. But, you know, I know this as the child of an undocumented family. You try really hard to be American. You know, I grew up in the 50s, the Donna Reed show. You know, just watch Nickelodeon. That was my adolescence and childhood. Terrifying. You know, I tried to make my mother wear an apron because Donna Reed wore one. And she just wore a little house coat when she cooked. So, you know, I came up in very white America. And I remember trying to make my mother give me bologna sandwiches in my lunch pail because I was embarrassed by my tacos and I didn't want her to send them anymore. Well, over time, I had to go back begging my mother for her recipes and trying to reclaim that sort of lost heritage. So I think that many of our students don't really realize that they have a repository and a treasury of cultural information. They may have to go back a couple of generations, but it's not lost. It's there. It's just that people stop talking about it because there aren't a lot of rewards. I thought it was really ironic that eventually Mexican food became the most popular fast food. And then I thought, so then why was I hiding the tacos? You know, why didn't, you know, but it was long ago and there was an embarrassment about your sort of cultural life. And now I think our young people have more of a positive sense about it. I was watching Eva Longoria the other day on one of the political things on television and thinking about how I wished I'd had an Eva Longoria when I was young to look at and to listen to, but I didn't. And so eventually in the collective movement of Chicanos, we found each other. And then once we found each other, we said, oh, well, what did you do here? And what did you do there? And then everybody had one thing in common. And I know this because I interviewed for my dissertation 10 of the most, well, they would now be called famous Chicano artists. And the one thread through it all was their grandmother, the abuela. She was the one who sometimes took care of them when the mothers and fathers were at work. She was the one that told them the stories of where they came from. She was the one that gave them the recipes. So I tell students, you just dig around a little bit. It's there. You know, we do have within the broader Latino community, I use Latinx sometimes because I kind of like it because it allows us to have a more expansive sense of our gender identity. And I think it's much freer for us. But it doesn't always work with people in the older generations. So I use Latino sometimes because I think it isn't as confusing to them. But Latinos in general have great diversity. And I don't know if people watch CNN, but Van Jones, during the whole process of the election and the counting of the votes, made some extraordinary statements about diversity because of the Latino vote, Cuban vote in Florida. And so he began to pull apart what we all know is the diversity and complexity of Latinos: Spanish speaking, bilingual, English speaking, working class, middle class, upper class, East Coast, West Coast, Southwest, Southeast. It's massive. And it's not just by, you know, original countries of origin, Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico. It's even more than that. It's how long ago your family immigrated here, what process of Americanization they went through. And there is a process because I went through it. And my grandmother was in the period of time where they actually instituted these Americanization lessons for Mexican mothers. It was really kind of fiendish and fascist at its core. But yeah, there is complexity, and I think we really need to do more work for ourselves to find it.
Thank you. We have, I think, enough time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
I will read this one. What are your experiences in community with ableism when the issues involve mental health for the artist?
So I'll try to talk about this without crying, okay? I was the in-home support service for my sister, Judith Mesa, for 20 years, and my sister was disabled. She had autoimmune condition. I have been through 7 surgeries and have had the elbow replaced, the knee replaced, have battled with walking. I walk with a cane. We have ramps in the house. And then my own background in clinical psychology has always made me aware of and cognizant of the mental health that our communities face. So I am a person who takes that into great consideration. As a person who battles with, you know, ableness, even when I arrive to places and there's no elevator and it's all stairs, I just have to take a big deep breath because I walk with a cane. I don't use a walker anymore, but I walk with a cane. And then I have to sort of get myself ready. I've actually had to leave meetings because I just simply couldn't go all the flights of stairs and the elevator wasn't working. So, and of late, as some people know, I've had a heart valve replacement. So I spent a number of years unable to travel when my cardiopulmonary issues were very bad. And so I've had to negotiate my own life as an able person or occasionally able person. And so I know what, to some degree, what some people face. And most of all, I think I call it mental health, but it's really compassion. We have in these last years become compassionless. We had the President of the United States of America mimic a disabled person in a public press conference. Astounding, beyond our thinking. The cruelty that we have watched in these years and become accustomed to, I think, has been an enormous threat to the disabled community and to the mental health of so many people. And so we have that work to do too. I mean, I'm not saying that everything is our responsibility, but I do believe that as artists and creative people, that the compassion that we bring to the work we do has to take into consideration how people access that work and how that work helps to heal their own sense of isolation, anxiety, depression, coming out of this pandemic, and we're not out of it yet. We have a renewed realization of the levels of anxiety and depression in everyday life for people who are not even officially known to have a mental health illness. So we're really at the precipice of this idea of healing. And healing has many forms, but it begins with compassion. We just have to nurture that in our young people. I've always felt that in public education, one of our absences or gaps is not teaching emotional intelligence. how to get things that seem normal. How do you get along with people? Can you wait for somebody else to take their turn? Can you take care of a child on the schoolyard if you're their friend, if they hurt themselves? What do you do? All of that is part of the building of compassion and awareness of the needs of others. And we need to do that.
Thank you, Amalia. For my apologies to audience members that this will be our last question. And I will try my best to edit this, not hopefully to change the meaning, but so that it'll be a little easier to reply to. So one part of this is that this person is a filmmaker who usually has distribution figured out before making anything. What's your process like as someone, for example, and I will interpret here, who's working in a very different kind of format, like a gallery, installing an exhibit, or your work in museums? So I guess this is a question about process and how you get to the point that you felt you have fulfilled the goals that you will set prior, during, or towards the end.
Well, I love this question. I love this question because when we built the Visual and Public Art Institute, our school, the California State University, Monterey Bay, used something called major learning outcomes. In other words, it's not just the discipline and checking off the box for all the courses you take, but what does that discipline want you to learn? What are the outcomes of having had that education? So our major learning outcomes began with the self and society. Then we looked at research, because we thought people should learn to be able to do that. We looked at community, how it is that you learn about communities, begin to work in communities. We looked at collaboration. What are the ways in which you can partner with others, and how can you begin to share the work, which is not always common to artists. And then there were areas around production itself. How do you make things? But the last one, which is one no one had ever done before, was called distribution. Because we said, if you know who you want to have this work, to access it, to be exposed to it, somewhere along the line, you have to build a system in which they can get to it. And since our students were working in community, that meant sometimes we would help them find a community venue, rent a storefront or get it for free so that they could work with people and have those people have access to it. My own level of distribution, and this begins from my development in the Chicano movement, which was that we saw ourselves, and this is funny, here comes the word elite again, we saw ourselves as anti-elites, that our job was to make work that would reflect the community, engage the community, maybe even educate the community. But first we had to get it to the community. So we built our own community institutions, which were at the beginning like little storefronts that we rented month to month. And then later institutional life changed and we could build a building, but that was very rare. So there was always the intention of distribution from the beginning. So people like Carmen Lomascaras and others, who were maybe the first ones to become well-known enough to be invited by museums to have retrospectives or one-woman shows. And so she had a non-negotiable deal. And the non-negotiable deal was called Family Sundays, which everybody uses now. But Carmen was one of the first people. So she said to them, okay, I'll do my show with you, but I want free admission on Sundays for all families, or I won't do it, because my people might not be able to afford your museum. And I want to be sure that they see it. And I would like you also to do an event in the community. So from the very beginning, we started developing these models. And even when I work in big museums, one of the first questions I have going in is, what kind of community venues do you have access to? What kind of work can I do? So when I did the first Holy Communion piece from the Venus Envy series, And this was in the Little Whitney, and I have to say that this was the 1993 Whitney Biennial, which is very controversial. And I was set to go into that, and then one of the advisors decided that my work was anti-intellectual because it was religious. So he didn't really understand that I was asking questions about patriarchy and feminism within the church or community memory. He didn't get any of that. So I didn't get in. And so one of the other curators, Thelma Golden, who ran the Little Whitney at Phillip Morris, put me in. And so she and I negotiated that if I was to go there, then I could work with groups. And so I worked with a group of students who were all, English language learners. And then I worked with another group that was interested in media, but who were all from different backgrounds. And so each of those groups would come to me and we would design a project. And one group was pregnant young women, mothers that weren't married. I don't know what the word is for it. And so eventually over the years, I built into almost all of my project a collective work. My most successful one was at Williams College, and they had been writing to me before because they knew my interests in Latin American studies. So they were protesting to get more Latin American studies faculty. And they went on a fast, which I told them not to do till the end, because otherwise I'll just wait for you to starve to death. But in any event, in the time of writing to them, they sent me videos of their protests. And so when I got to Williams College, I already knew them. And I set up a piece, including Sor Juana's library. She was a 16th century nun in Mexico, New Spain. And I gave over to them a section of the piece that would be a library room for them, where they could place articles they thought people should read, and where they could, after I was gone, host meetings. So in each of those moments, I attempted to build in the distribution from the original. I don't think you can do it after the fact. I think when you're the artist and they're negotiating with you to come and do a piece, that is when you have the power to negotiate the way that you want others to interact with your work. Pepón Osorio is the master. If anyone wants to know about distribution, just study his works. When he did, any of the major pieces, he would work it out that the museum couldn't have the show till they showed it in the community first, not after, first. They had to rent a storefront. They had to let him do his piece there. It's amazing. I mean, he negotiated the reform piece that I showed today with Temple University, and those students regularly came to campus. So their lives are forever changed by the fact that they have seen a university. They have been on a college campus. They know what is possible. So I believe that distribution should be inherently built into the work you do, whether you're going straight to the community or whether you're working with an art gallery, or I don't do galleries, but a museum, or I like community centers. So I discovered in my work, once I went too far in the museums, that I don't know how to say this nicely, it made me sick. Okay, I got sick. I got a cardiopulmonary condition, and it was the stress of trying to force museum people to act right, and they didn't want to act right. And they would invite you to scold them, and then you'd leave, and they go right back to the same old exclusive behavior. So in the midst of doing that, I realized I need to go home. I need to go home, back to my community, and I need to work on the institutions there. And I need to help a new generation to take over those other institutions so they'll act right. So I started a project called Regeneration in 1993 when I got my MacArthur, and that's one of the things I invested in. And I now have probably 50 adults. They're probably now almost 50, as this was a long time ago. And they're all over the country. They're curators. They work at the Smithsonian. They work at Williams College. They work everywhere. And I am really proud of that, because I think if we want to change institutions, then we have to build new people to go to the institutions. I learned that the hard way. The last person you're going to change is a 60-something-year-old white man who runs a major institution. He has no desire. His investment is in that model that he has of exclusive elite art, and you just need to not waste your time with that. What you need to do is educate young curators, as you are doing at MICA, to grow up and to begin to open up those institutions in diverse and collaborative ways with community.
Well, Amalia, thank you. Let me take one moment to thank all the people at MICA that have made your visit possible. So I'd like to thank the events office, communications office, grad studies, provost office. I want to thank the MFACA faculty, including Paula Phillips, and of course the MFACA students, especially our famous Jen F, as you may have noticed on the chat. But let's all please especially thank Amalia Mesa-Bains for joining us, and that we hope to meet you again often and ongoing. So
And maybe someday in person. I just
Yeah.
want to say I am so grateful to MICA. Like many of you, I've stewed over these last 4 years, over this election, over its aftermath, and the opportunity to talk about issues of democracy and liberation and justice and struggles for human rights is just a great opportunity, because all of us are going to be engaged in that work in the months and years ahead. And so I thank you, Ken, for the years of friendship and support and the shared work that we've done together, which I think we can be quite proud of. I'm grateful to everyone on the staff who helped us to do this day today. So remember, the path ahead is yours.